Five Plain Questions is proud to present this miniseries highlighting the impactful work of the Waterers through the lens of their giftees. Together, we're celebrating community-led change and amplifying stories that disrupt traditional philanthropy and foster local power. Hello, and welcome again to another episode of Five Plain Questions, a podcast that proposes 5 questions to Indigenous artists, creators, musicians, writers, movers and shakers, and culture bearers, people in the community that are doing great things for their communities. I'm Joe Williams, your host for this conversation. My goal is to showcase these amazing people in our Indigenous communities from around the region and country. I want to introduce you to Dr. Kate Beane. Dr. Kate Beane holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. She is the executive director of the Minnesota Museum of American Art and serves as adjunct faculty in the American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is vice chair of the board at Vision Maker Media, a national organization based out of Nebraska. In 2020, she was appointed by Governor Walz to serve as on the Capital Area Architectural and Planning Board, which oversees capital complex preservation and development. Previously, Kate served on the leadership team at the Minnesota Historical Team, where she was the director of Native American initiatives, engaging in both Native American communities and tribes and advocating for the implementation of Indigenous interpretation and involvement at historical sites throughout the state. With that said, let's jump into this conversation with Dr. Kate Beane. Dr. Kate Beane, thank you so much for joining me here at Five Plain Questions. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
If we could start off, can you introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so Hamita Kiapi, Kate Beane Makiapi, Washichuia, Dr. Kate Beane Makiapi, Dakota Ahedipiwin Deme, Yuskiamachin Kapi, Damakota, Wakpai Pakshan Ed Omawapi Ka Wana, Chekpa Otue Edwati. So hello, my relatives. I'm in English. I'm known as Kate Beane, and in Dakota, I'm known as Bringstem Homewoman. I am Dakota. I'm a citizen of the Flanders Santee Sioux Dakota Nation, which is in South Dakota today, but historically was here in Minnesota Makoche, and still is. And I'm also Muskogee Creek on my mother's side, but I was raised Dakota. And these days, I live in the Twin Cities.
Thank you for that. It's always great to hear Dakota in conversation. I appreciate you sharing that. Would you, we're always influenced by influences throughout our lives, and that changes when we're younger to who and what influences today. And I was wondering if you could share who those biggest influences are and what is influencing you currently.
Biggest influences for me, I think over the years, it's kind of depend on my era. I'm 47 years old at this point. And over the years, I think when I was younger, I was really influenced by music and art. I was influenced by Frida Kahlo as a mixed race woman and storyteller who experienced great heartbreak and physical pain and was so strong and defied like all of these expectations of who she should be. I was inspired by Bikini Kill and Kathleen Hanna and girlfriends of mine that were in punk rock bands, such as Raoul, which was a band that my girlfriends were a part of on Lookout Records, and they played with Bikini Kill. So I was really inspired by punk rock women, and the whole Riot Grrrl movement, I think, was our era when I was growing up in the San Francisco East Bay, going to Gilman Club and learning, learning about empowerment. And then my father, who's always been a big mentor to me, he introduced me to my grandfather, Charles Eastman's writings. And Ohiesa, Charles Eastman, was a big influence for me over the years. I think when I was younger, I had a hard time really understanding his words and what they meant for me. And then later on, as I reread his work, it made a lot of sense and really helped ground me. And then obviously the matriarchs in my family, women writers, women like Linda Hogan, Louise Erdrich, all of these amazing Mona Susan Power, all these amazing women, Diane Wilson. Um, they help me to remember who I am.
Sure, sure. It's that's quite a list there, all the way through. That's amazing. Um, I want to step back. This is more of personal interest. You were in the San Francisco Bay Area. Was that during your upbringing, or like college years, or how did that look?
Yeah, so my family, we're from Wakwai Paksham, Bend in the River, Flandreau, and my father was born and raised on a reservation, and then for to find work, left the reservation, and so we ended up being raised. He was a community organizer trained under Saul Alinsky out of Chicago, and we were brought up in urban native areas all over the country. So I was born at the Phoenix Indian Hospital, grew up going to preschool at the Lincoln Indian Center, and then moved to the San Francisco East Bay area, and grew up there. And that that era of sort of growing up in California was really interesting because I felt like I was given this great privilege of feeling like anything is possible. I mean, I was hanging out at the punk rock club with the guys from Green Day, and could go to concerts in San Francisco at Bottom of the Hill, and I just felt like this world was fully like there was just so much possibility. And I know that a lot of people in our communities don't grow up that way. My husband was born and raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation. He always talks about when he was growing up in school, teachers always told him like think small. And I think as a Native youth, one of the things that I realized was that I didn't fit in anywhere. The punk rock scene was so white, and I really made a lot of friends and was inspired by like X-Ray Specs and like all of these artists that were artists of color within that movement. But then felt like I didn't really belong anywhere, or like pieces of me belonged in different spaces. And California was a really interesting place to sort of like figure out what that meant for me. Um, I love the ocean. I've always been drawn to water, and I think now looking back, it was really being drawn to the lakes and the rivers here in Minnesota that I identified with and could relate to. But I dropped out of high school when I was 15. I went to Berkeley High School, and I was one of the first students to do online learning there, which didn't go very well. And teachers didn't encourage me to stay in school. They said, hey, there's a test you can take at 16 and you can legally leave school. And they encouraged me and my twin sister to do that. So we left school at 15, which really created this shift in us really realizing and feeling like we were expected to be small. Opportunities weren't there. I worked my ass off for years, living all over the country, living out of my car as a waitress and traveling. And so I spent a lot of time traveling around the country, waiting tables, working in factories. I was a high school lunch lady in Chicago at one point, which was really weird because I was only 19. Like I had all these crazy jobs, and I was always working for someone else, and was very well read. And that was one thing my father introduced and inspired our passion for reading, and was always reading, was always going to libraries and museums and studying the places where I was at and really interested in the history of those places. So understanding why the names of places were what they were, why neighborhoods were named what they were, really understanding the indigenous people of all the different places where I was at, even though I knew my indigenous roots didn't come from those places, like in California. Um, understanding what happened at Alcatraz, why, and talking with some of the women who were part of that movement, who were dear friends of my family, um, and having those conversations and learning that history from the people who are a part of it.
Those, that journey and those experiences really structure how our lives are afterwards, right? It's not just a direct line from A to B or A to Z where there's nothing in between. There's so much value in that experience.
When I tell people that I grew up in California and that I lived in Berkeley, they assume I went to UC Berkeley. And it's like,
Mm,
no, I served coffee and I hung out on the rooftops with my friends, crashed a couple parties and I was, I always felt like that campus was not for me. Like that separation of school happened very early on in elementary school. And it was because of history class,
sure.
and it was feeling like there was this us versus them mentality, and then learning the history of my grandparents who were raised in boarding schools, and then being very very angry as a young person, to be honest. And I think that's where understanding that anger was really important for me to figure out, like, okay, what do you do with it?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just drawing all this in. So much experience. I lived in California in the '90s as well, in San Francisco, and so that that is a place of possibilities that feels unique only to San Francisco or the Bay Area. It's a different vibe than LA or any other large city. It's definitely a city of possibilities. And as someone who worked in a school cafeteria at the age of 19 also, I can understand that grind. uh, Being up at being in the kitchen at 5 in the morning getting breakfast ready for the kids and all that.
With
That's
these
hard
wild
work.
Polish ladies from Chicago, it was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your career. At some point there was a shift, and so what was that shift? And um, uh, can you share your college experience and your post college experience as your career was developing?
Yeah, so like I said, I spent a lot of years working for other people, serving people. Um, I was a caterer server in a lot of different cities, and I utilized that time period just to live and learn about these places. And what I realized is, again, like I loved reading, I loved research, I loved, like, I would walk when I lived in Chicago. I would walk from where I lived in west side of the city, like 3 miles to the Newberry Library and play researcher. And I would go and I would just start like looking through the archives, and I would put on the gloves, and like I was like playing this role, and I was really young. I had never finished school. The only real high school experience I had was like working in the cafeteria, really. Um, and what I realized at a certain point is that my grandparents really worked hard and struggled in their lives for me to have a better life. And I felt like, and at this point too, I had substance abuse issues. I was in an unhealthy relationship. I had personal things that were going on that a lot of people have going on as young people. And I just remember there was like this click where I was like, my grandparents didn't go through what they went through for me to live like this. And I would find comfort in reading, and I would be so invested in reading American Indian Studies books and history books. And I realized that I really I wanted to do that. I wanted to study. I wanted to go to school, but I wanted it to be on my own terms. And I was tired of not feeling comfortable in school. Um, and tired of being scared of those places where I didn't feel like I belonged. And so for me, it was a matter of determining, like, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I have a twin sister who was going back to school around that time. I had lived in Tennessee and then moved back to Chicago, and moved back to the Bay Area. My sister bought me a plane ticket and said, come home. And
Mm,
so I got home, and then my family, all adults at this point, I was in my mid 20s, said, we're moving to Minnesota. We're going to move home as Dakota people together. And I was like, well, I just got here. And then I was like, Minnesota. And my sister's like, yeah, there's a Dakota language program at the University of Minnesota. And we're going to go to community college. And then we're going to go. And again, neither one of us had graduated from high school. So we transferred over to Minneapolis Community and Technical College, moved to the Twin Cities together as a family, like lived in a hotel, one room hotel, and figured out how we were going to make it work. And then my twin sister and I went back to school together. She had also left school at the same time as I did. And we went back to school. We supported each other through that process. And she was much better at math. I was better at writing. Like we were like this power couple, I think, in some ways, where we could really support one another. And went back to school, transferred to the University of Minnesota, and it was the American Indian Studies department at the University of Minnesota in the Dakota language program. And at that point, it was Chante Mansa, Neil McKay, who was teaching Dakota language. And that whole period of time, and I think I was 3 years in that program, that changed my life. It really did. And it was a matter of really understanding, when we started at school, I was one of those people who was afraid to like speak in front of people, had serious anxiety, was really ashamed that I didn't know my language, and embarrassed that the non-native students were like memorizing it and getting it. And I was really struggling, and it made me feel bad about myself. And it was seeking out mentorship by Glenn Washichuna from Sioux Valley, who is a dear, dear relative. He's the one who gave me my Dakota name, or my Dakshi. And him having that spiritual side of reconnecting with my language, and then Chante Maza and having that support of a really, really good teacher, and just brother, and going through that process. Helped save us, both of us. And she ended up graduating and going to law school. And I went to Auckland, New Zealand. I decided I wanted to move on the other side of the world and study Maori language. And so I studied Maori history, Maori language revitalization at Auckland Uni, and then came back, taught Dakota language preschool for a while, and then realized I was really interested in how we lost access to our language. Like, I wasn't a language teacher as much as I loved it. And loved teaching children. I was like, okay, I know I want to teach my own children. I'm preparing for that someday when I decide to become a mother. But I was more interested in the history and the why. And I was really, really interested in the relationship between place and language. So again, that understanding of history of why things are named what they are, where the stories that come along with those places, like that was my passion, and the storytelling aspect and the representation piece. And so I went to applied to one school. I applied to one program, the American Studies department at the University of Minnesota, and entered their doctoral program.
Hmm. It's not lost on me, that our Dakota language, when there's a place named or something is named in Dakota, there's not a one-to-one translation to English. There's usually a story. There's a lesson behind the name, and also a journey from the origins of the story to how the name came to be. And it's I wouldn't say it's a difficult language to translate, but it's a complicated translation.
Yeah, it's not a literal translation.
Mhm.
And I learned that, I think the first Dakota language class I took, my sister and I went home to our reservation and visited with our grandma and our uncle. And my uncle Bill was our tribal historian at the time. And my grandmother knew our grandfather, Charles Eastman. He was actually her great uncle. And she had known him as a little girl. Her mother had transcribed one of his books. And her grandfather was John Eastman, Charles Eastman's brother. And my uncle said, "Oh, you're taking Dakota language," because, again, that was the last generation. My grandmother's mother was the last generation to be fully fluent in our language. My grandmother understood the language. She would translate if somebody was praying, but she could not physically speak it.
Hmm.
And that was what was ingrained in her from boarding school. Like, she knew the language, she understood it, but she couldn't speak it. She could sing Dakota hymns, and so we would go to the First Presbyterian Church and Flandreau, and we would sing the Don't Want Be songs,
Mhm.
but I never heard her speak it. I only heard her sing. And so my uncle had this whole package of letters that my grandfather John Eastman had written in Dakota to his daughter Grace, my grandmother's mother. And he handed them to me and my sister, and he said, "Can you translate these? We don't know what we say."
Oh.
And that's where our relationship with our Dekshi Galen Washichuna really, we started visiting with him. He was living in outside Prior Lake at the time, first language fluent speaker, And we started sharing the letters with him, and we visiting with him, and he started working with us to help translate some of those letters. And that whole process of translating those letters with him, it was really funny too, because we would go through line by line, and it would take a whole evening to do one letter, which was just
Sure.
usually like front and back of a page. But it was trying to understand the context. Like if just the literal translation, we wouldn't always understand. But if you knew that we were talking about the weather, or, you had to have that broader context. There was a lot of older language that hadn't been used over the years. That was a part of it that was really interesting. There were
Yeah.
place names that were descriptions that would talk, because our place names are mostly descriptions or how we interact with a place. And so those were really interesting to hear about these place names, hear our family story, our family health history. But there was one moment where we were sitting there translating a letter, and there was a word, and I cannot for the life of me remember what the word was, but it was a word that we could not translate. We were trying to figure out what it was. And then Dekshi's wife, my auntie Gwen Westerman, popped in, and she's like, "Come on, you guys." And she said the word, and it was an English word that had been thrown in there. So we spent an hour trying to translate an English word that she was just doing.
Oh, that's funny. Little little slang in there in a sense. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, yeah, because
Oh,
that's what our people did. I mean, we talk to elders, and you're like, okay, so how do we translate this? And it reminds me of like my husband is always laughing about one of his uncle Chubs, who he asked him, how do you say grasshopper in Dakota or in Lakota? And he said, "Peji hop hop." Like, or how do you say this? And you'll ask an elder, and they'll be like, "You say it in English." Like, it's
sure. It's almost a, yeah, yeah, sort of this common sense sort of filler. I like that. So, before we move on, can we talk a little bit how you became the executive director over at the Minnesota Museum of American Art? How did that come about?
so I entered the museum field. I was a so I finished my dissertation at Dartmouth as a fellow, as a Charles Eastman fellow, and then which my father kind of documented that story in one of his films, "Oh, He is the Soul of an Indian," and then did my president's postdoc at UC California. Was recruited back here to work at the Minnesota Historical Society by the CEO, Steve Elliott, at the time, under a fellowship. And I started at the bottom, sort of as a fellow, and worked my way up. And as I was working my way up in that institution, I was told every step of the way, "There's no upward mobility for you here. Like, this is like pretty much it. Like, a lot of places they prepare you to go somewhere else." And I was like, "No, I'm gonna do. I mean, I'm gonna. There's more work to be done here." And my dad had always taught me that you have to get to the point in your career where you create the job that you know needs to get done. And so that's what I did within that institution. And eventually, I was the head of the director of Native American Initiatives, as it was called at the time, which engaged with tribes and community members across the region in terms of environmental, or in terms of stewardship of some of the sites. Places like Fort Snelling, which is a really difficult site for us as Dakota people, as that's where our people were imprisoned after the war. And is also our site of creation, and that institution manages that site. And so I engage with a lot of community members around that site, worked around a lot of tough histories here in Minnesota. And as my father taught me, when there's something really, really difficult happening, like, you go towards the fire. Like, that's where the help is needed. Like, you don't become afraid of it. Like, that's where you need to be. And I kind of took that mentality and started taking on a lot of difficult histories. And in doing a lot of that work, I became really drawn to public art. And my family had worked on the name restoration at Beane, which is our family ancestral village site, which was called Lake Calhoun for a long time. And then our family worked with community to restore the Dakota name, Beane, White Banks Lake. And we went through that name restoration process, which was a long process. It was taken all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court on appeal, and it was a very complicated process, which I then became engaged with when I was in my seat at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I was engaged at a personal level as well as at a professional level. And throughout that process, I just became more and more engaged with public art. And we worked on some public art at Bede Makaska with Sandra Spieler, Mona Smith, um, and Angela Two Stars, and created this beautiful public art project on the southeast side of the lake. I helped write the grant and engaged with the park board in the city on creating that space. And then just through public art, I realized that art could do so much more than text on a plaque. Like there was this way to develop empathy and emotion, and in a place that is so heavily politicized in Minnesota, where people like don't want to talk about social justice, where there's some hesitancy, and I think it's worse now even. But at that time, those narratives were still there. There was still a lot of settler descendants. My family got hate mail. I was attacked quite a bit, and it became pretty scary at that moment at the Historical Society, because I was attacked by this group, this conservative think tank that was putting stuff out there, trying to get me to lose my job, attacking me at the legislature, with the board, within the institution I was working at. And then they posted pictures of my kids. And at that point, that was too much for me, because I was worried about the safety of my kids. And I realized, like, okay, I'm more drawn, I get inspired by art. I was tired, I was sad and frustrated. And a dear friend of mine, Jim Denemy, who's an amazing Ojibwe artist who sadly passed away a few years ago, was previously on the board of the Minnesota Museum of American Art, and he was on the hiring committee. Him and a group of folks recruited me to work at the Minnesota Museum of American Art, also known as the M, which is also in downtown St. Paul. It's really an artist and community-led institution at this point, though historically it wasn't necessarily. And there was an institution going through a lot of transition that hadn't had an executive director for a while. And Jim is the one who pestered me and said, you need to come here. We need you here. Artists need you here at the M. And I realized, I was like, okay, well, my longer background isn't in art, but I'm being pulled into that world, and there's a reason for it. And so I just kind of let it happen and agreed to come here to the M. At that point, the museum was closed. It was post-COVID, and it hadn't reopened yet. And there was a $14.5 million capital project that had to be closed in order for the museum to reopen. And there was a lot of, it was boarded up, under construction, and really kind of, a lot to walk into. And it's probably better I didn't know what I was getting into at that time, but I took it on, and I've been here for almost 4 years.
Wow. Jim, I loved his work. Love the satire and the commentary that he had under the work. And I tried really hard to get him on this podcast early on, but at that point he wasn't able to. And so, but we have his art, and so many have been able to share his story. So it's great to hear your connection with him. So we're sort of in this question right now, but I guess how have opportunities affected your life, and how do they come to you, or do you create your own opportunities at this point, which you've kind of alluded to with your father's guidance?
Yeah, I think in terms of job opportunities, employment, in a lot of ways, it's thinking about what work needs to get done, and how do you strategize for the work. And the way that I was mentored by people who I love and admire, people like my dad, like my twin Gwen Westerman, is that you have to create something sustainable, and it's not about people, it's not about ego. You take yourself out. It's about the work. Something happens to me tomorrow, the work has to be able to continue. And so creating these sustainable spaces where the work can keep going, because that's what it's about. It's about creating opportunities for future generations, and making sure that you're, and I'm really interested in systems change, not system navigation. Like I always talk about the ways in which I feel like we've been taught how to navigate these systems and how to get by. Like when I entered the museum field, I was always like hanging out in the basement with the people who were like, well, this is how you go rogue. And I'm like, well, why? Like, it should be this way, right? And so really interested in actual systems change, and working with artists and community to help create some of that change within the city, within the state. And nationally, really, thinking about the ways that we can make a real impact. That's going to make a real difference and not be so performative and superficial. Name registrations aren't going to fix everything in the world, but there's a ripple effect, and we've seen it. We've seen representation matters. We've seen that being able to show our young people that when you're told no and you keep working at it and you can actually get it done, that inspires them to do things themselves and to get their education and to go out there and to speak their truth and to support community. And so there's all kinds of opportunities out there. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's kind of the universe leading you, and you have to be able to listen to it, and be in tune with that. And so there's a spiritual side to it. I'm part of a Sundance family, and being prayerful about it, and really having that way of understanding that things are going to happen as they're supposed to happen, when they're supposed to happen. If you have an event and 3 people show up, those are the 3 people that are supposed to be there. And really just having that sense of peace and faith that the universe is working in a way. Your elders, your ancestors, those spirits are working in a way to support you, where you're supporting one another. Being that voice, I think it's just really important to be in tune with that, and to think beyond yourself, to think about the bigger picture, which is really, really hard as a leader. It's not always fun. Decisions have to get made that aren't easy. Sometimes there's information or things that are going on that the broader public is not aware of, and that's really hard. But you have to be in a place where you have that maturity to know that you're making decisions that are for the best of what's to come.
Sure, sure. No, I can appreciate that. Absolutely. With that said, what would you say to the 18 to 22-year-old that's listening to this conversation?
Find your passion. Find what energizes you. I mean, life is hard and it's exhausting, and it's so easy to just not want to deal with things. When I was younger, I remember arguing with my dad when I was leaving school at 15 and being like, I didn't create this problem. Like, it's not for me to fix. And I think finding whatever it is that you're most passionate about, thinking about ways that you can do that, and so many artists. I mean, I met Jim because he was painting houses. I worked at Birch Bark Books, Louis Erdrich's bookstore. We're all family friends, and I worked at that bookstore on my way through college, and Jim would come and stop in and sit there in his painter's clothes, and we would visit and chat, and then he got the Jerome Fellowship, then he got the McKnight, and I work with artists all the time who start painting when they're 40. We had an artist who her first show, she was 80 years old. And now I serve on the board for the Jerome Foundation. And I'm always like really inspired by these artists who start their careers later in life. And we've seen this historically, specifically with women who are raising kids and families, and, men too. Obviously, my husband is one of those who, he's an artist and we're raising kids, and, he kind of does it on the side. But being able to find that passion and figure out a way, whether it's your job and then that passion, the job supports you while you do that passion, or figuring out how to make that passion a part of your everyday life, I think is really, really important. What most excites you? What drives you? There's no way you can finish school if you are just doing it because someone is telling you you're supposed to. Like, you have to figure out why you're doing it. You have to figure out a way. It doesn't really matter what your degree is in. Like, it really doesn't. I used to teach at community college. My dad and I created some of the courses that weren't available when I went to school there, like the Dakota culture and history, Dakota language. We started those courses at MCTC because they didn't exist when I went to school there. And I used to talk to students, I was like, just finish. It doesn't matter what you finish in, getting that and being showing and getting those tools that you can complete something. is what's most important. Following through is what's most important. And then you can really do, I mean, you can do what you want. You know, majority of people don't work in the field of what they got their bachelor's degree in. You know, I'm in a field that's interdisciplinary, American Studies. And I went into American Studies because I was inspired by a quote by Charles Eastman about what it meant to be an American. And I was like critiquing, what is an American? And now I'm the executive director of the Minnesota Museum of American Art. And we've had a lot of conversations about, yeah, we're a museum of American art, and we're going to critique what is American art and what is fine art and who is an American. You know, we're going to critique what people think that is. And I feel that way in terms of the state level of Minnesotans. You know, I always say these borders are not ours. The Minnesota Museum of American Art is more regional. You know, I don't follow these borders. I don't believe in that. My people were removed. And so I think just finding what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, because that's what gives you energy.
No, that's so well said. As you're talking about this, I think about our borders. There's I'm a Wapituan, and we have Wapitan here in North Dakota, but also up in Canada, there's a Wapitan up there too. And so our bands extended far, far north of
Absolutely.
the colonial borders. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some really awesome maps, some historical maps that sometimes I use when I've taught and stuff that show our Dakota territory, which probably pisses off some tribes. But it's just such a broader. It's up into Canada, and it's like, and I'm Wapitan too, Wahpetua. We're probably cousins, I'm sure.
Uh, yeah, we're related to the Westermans, so yeah, yeah. Yeah, my dad grew up with Floyd, so yeah.
Oh, my dad did too. I think our
Yeah.
dads probably were old buddies. My Floyd and my dad grew up on the Flander Indian School campus together.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Lots of stories, lots of old stories, which are more humorous than anything else that probably can't share on the podcast, but we'll talk offline. So what's coming up? What's on the horizon for you right now?
Well, right now, so September 18th, we opened an exhibition here called Queering Indigeneity. And so that's in partnership with Penny Kagigabi from White Earth, which is a multi-year project, and it's a really fun project. So a couple years ago, we ended up in conversation with Penny talking about, as part of this project of rural urban initiative, where one of our curators here met Penny and then introduced me, and we started talking about, what are ways that we can work together. And Penny was sort of this matriarch and maternal sort of support for a lot of trans, queer, two-spirit, and digiqueer artists across the upper Midwest. And so we started this project, Queering Indigeneity, where right now we open this exhibition of 16 queer, trans, two-spirit, indigiqueer artists across the upper Midwest. Majority of them have never been shown before. They've never exhibited before. Their artwork is amazing. It's absolutely stunning. A lot of them live in more rural areas where, they feel really isolated from one another. And we created this, Penny really has created this support network for them, where they've been meeting online over the last year and a half or so, and being that support network for one another, inspiring one another to create their work. And we opened the work, and about a month and a half ago, we had our opening reception, and they were able to come in and meet for the first time in person. We had one artist who brought 40 of his relatives from the Navajo reservation, and it was just so beautiful. Noah Polk, and he's an amazing artist. And there's just so many, Madeline Troyer, Gawaden, like these Awanagishik Bruce, like
Lonnie?
just Celia Touche, like these artists that are just doing this phenomenal work, are all in this gallery here. And now we're in conversation with places like Art Bridges and other foundations, and we're continuing to fundraise and to think about the next iteration of the project. Penny always talks about it as a project with a side of exhibition. So the exhibition is just a piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're thinking about how we can possibly create something that travels to community. We'd love to create curriculum. I did a tour of like 40 St. Paul art school educators through the exhibit last month, and one of them broke down into tears, and I asked her, I was like, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I just moved here from Texas and this wouldn't be allowed there." And we as an institution, we've lost donors in doing some of this work. When I came on, I had one donor who said, "What is this, becoming the BIPOC Museum of American Art?" There's been criticism thinking that we were going to get rid of all the historic white artists in the collection. People like Paul Manship, who we have a large collection of. And what we've shown here is that no, it's an additive process. It's not about erasure. Like, we know what it's like to be erased. We're not doing that. We restored the Cass Gilbert stained glass ceiling in our museum. Cass Gilbert also designed the Minnesota State Capitol. But we're also going to put it in conversation with contemporary living artists and a more diverse representation of the state. So we have a permanent collection show which highlights 150 works from our permanent collection called Here Now. And that exhibition will be up for another 2 years. We're going to do some regular rotations. It has native art throughout the entire space, because there's no reason why we need to be isolated off into a separate gallery.
Absolutely.
We're all the way throughout. And then also we have a room specifically focused on George Morrison at the end, because we've got the largest George Morrison collection in the world and wonderful relationship with Hazel and Breon and the whole family. We just partnered with the Met. And the George Morrison's Magical City opened at the Met. I was just there for that opening reception a few weeks ago. I brought my daughter with me, and that was really, really magical itself and fun. And so we have a lot of different partnerships. Everything we do is in partnership. It's all about co-creating, co-curating, partnering. We don't even come up with any of our own ideas. It's all responsive to what artists and community want to do. Everything from partnering with the Met to partnering with an artist down the street.
That's wonderful. Penny's coming back on the program here in a few weeks, and so she's an old friend. We used to work. I created this Summer Art Institute some years back, and she was one of our teaching artists for a number of years, and she fostered that group, and it turned into this thing where there was a core group of students that came back every year. And it was just a joy having them come back and create and go to college, And so I've seen through your website, I've seen the exhibition and the list. I got to stop down and see it in person. But, Chewy's in there.
It'll be open for another 10 months, so you have time.
Okay. Well, I want to beat the snow, so we'll see what happens.
Definitely come and visit. Yeah, Penny is amazing. She creates these spaces, and any sort of good exhibition is an experience, like an experience when you walk through, and you have to, it's not just about sight lines, it's about relationships. And Penny helps create. This was her first time curating an exhibition. And it was a really, really wonderful experience. And our opening reception, we had DJ Justin Broken Rope, and I was able to hear Buddy Redbow in the galleries, and I felt like my job had been done.
I love it. Oh, I love it. I grew up on Buddy Redbow tapes in my mom's car, driving back and forth. That's great. Where can the listener find your work and be able to connect with you?
So the Minnesota Museum of American Art website, mmaa.org. All of our information is there. You can join our newsletter. I've got Facebook. Instagram is kind of more personal stuff, but Facebook, I do have followers on there. To be friends on Facebook, it's usually like I have to actually met you, but I also have followers and post public stuff that with my work there as well. I'm also on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to find. A lot of times, most of the time I'm here in St. Paul at 350 Robert Street North, and our museum is open Thursday through Sunday from 10 to 4.
That's fantastic. For the listener, always encourage boundaries, but go check out the museum. The website's amazing. Dr. Beane, thank you so much for sitting down with me on the podcast. This was great. Thank you.
No, be done, Maya.
And that does it for this episode of 5 Plain Questions. I want to thank Dr. Beane again for her time and sharing her story with us. It's remarkable how many guests that I have on this program. I feel like there are parallel experiences where I can relate to so much of what they've been through. And so, growing up on the Sistine Wapiti, I remember being at like a rural Episcopal church as a child, and the grandmothers, the Kushis, would be singing the hymnals in those high-pitched voices in Dakota, or to my time in San Francisco, sitting on top of my apartment building, just taking in the city at night after a long day of studio work at art school, and our community connections and the stories of our elders. This was a conversation that I deeply appreciated, and I'm very grateful for. So, Dr. Kate Beane, thank you so much for your time, and thank you.
And I want to thank you for joining us and spending your time listening to what I feel is a very important story and perspective from our community. So please, join us next time as we speak with another incredible person. I'm Joe Williams. Thank you for listening to 5 Plain Questions. Your support helps us keep these conversations going. You can follow us on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and Blue Sky. And to stay connected, visit us on 11warriorarts.com to explore past episodes, check out our exclusive merch, and to sign up for our newsletter. Every listen, share, and purchase helps support this podcast. This episode was made possible with support of the Waterers, whose dedication to community-led change and disrupting traditional philanthropy inspires us all. To learn more about their work and how you can get involved, visit their website at www.waterers.org. That's WATERERS.org. Thanks for listening. Support for this podcast also comes from Art of the Rural, working to advance rural culture and equity through collaboration, media, and the arts. This has been an 11 Warrior Arts production.